we're going to do a panettone. Now, panettone is obviously a specialty bread. It's usually at times things like Christmas and things like that, but you can have it at other times of the year. I think Easter's another time. Quite often Italians would have panettone, but panettone is a bit of a specialty sort of bread, and it's quite long and complicated. Hence, here we are in evening of day one, starting it with stage one. And we're going to make a pasta madre. Now that means mother dough, and normally this would be done with some sort of natural leaven. It's a bit like a sourdough starter type thing. Okay, but we're going to use dried yeast. No problem with that, but it just means that the flavours that develop will be slightly different from if you were using some sort of natural leavening agent. I mean, dried yeast is a natural leavening agent, it's just the fact it's been dried and it's commercialised, isn't it? So the first thing I'm going to do is I've got 50 grams of warm water. I'm going to add that to about a gram of that active yeast. And then in here I've got some basically organic type O flour. Okay, it's very fine, Italian in this case, and I've got 100 grams in there. And what we're going to do is we're just going to get that yeast, let that just sort of slightly activate a bit. Then we're going to mix it together to a dough, a bit like we're making a sourdough starter. There's my sourdough starter, which has nothing to do with this. Okay, I only fed it earlier, that's why it don't look like it's doing much. And then we're going to leave this overnight. It's going to have about 6 or 7 hours to ferment, and then we're going to move to stage 2 on day 2, early in the morning, very early in this case, because that is going to be another 6 to 7 hour stage. And it's not until we get to stage 3 where we're starting to get something that's a bit more like a bread dough, that's going to have your traditional panettone ingredients in it. We're going to have some candied peel in it, some raisins, some panettone essence. Well, we'll come to that when we come to it. So we're just going to give this a few more minutes, and then we'll get mixing that together. I'm just giving this a little stir with a cocktail stick because there's not much in here, is there? And then I'm just going to tip that all into there, and we want to mix this into a nice little dough. And then essentially we've completed stage 1. Well, we've completed what we're going to do in terms of messing around with it. Now it's quite obviously quite a dry dough, as you can see from this, but I'm just going to mix that all in, and then we're just going to cover it over, and then, like I say, it's going to sit there for about 6 hours. So hopefully in that time the yeast will work its magic on the sort of carbohydrates in the flour, and we will see some form of, you know, rise going on. Now, like I said, traditionally this would be done with some sort of natural sort of yeast, if you like. Not quite the same as a sourdough starter, because we're not giving it that amount of time for it to develop that sort of sourness. So I'll see you early tomorrow morning, although for you, you will have a clue what time it is, won't you? But just rest assured, it's going to be about 7 hours time. Okay, a panettone is not for the faint-hearted. It's better bloody work out at the end. Very early, very, very early, on day 2. Just need a bit of a caffeine kick. So, here is our pasta madre that we've left overnight, 7 to 8 hours, and you can see it has begun to ferment. It has increased in volume. Okay, and what we're going to do now is prepare a bigger or biger, which is like a second ferment. So this makes more dough, but we're now going to leave that, or will be leaving that, for another 7 hours to do another ferment before we make up our final dough. So in here I've got 220 grams of the same flour that I made my pasta madre with, and to that I'm going to add some caster sugar. Now this is 30 grams of ordinary caster sugar. If you've got golden caster sugar, which I haven't, then you can use that. And then I've also got here 100 grams of just cold water. In that goes, and then finally we're just going to take that pasta madre, and all of that is going to go in there, and what we've now got to do is combine it all. So obviously one of the problems will be making sure we break up that pasta madre and get that incorporated in with the sugar and the extra flour and the water. Now you could do this in your stand mixer, but there's not an awful lot here to work with, so I'm just going to mix this. Didn't want to be in there. Mix this by hand, and then we're going to add some softened butter. I've got 30 grams there of unsalted butter, and that's going to go in, and we're going to rub that in, and that will be our final ingredient at this stage. So like I said, we would then be leaving it to hopefully rise significantly. He says that now, setting him up for a foul. Before we move on to make our final dough, but that in turn needs about 6 or 7 hours to do a third ferment, if you like. So like I said, this is a long process. I've just been working this dough for just over 5 minutes now, and it's becoming a lot less drier. I was a bit worried at first. It seemed very dry, but you keep working it and it gradually starts smoothing out. It's not a sticky dough by any means, but it is becoming more pliable, if you like, more elastic. And now, final thing to do is, like I say, add that butter. So I'm just going to spread that a little bit and take that softened butter, and this is where now we're going to work all that butter all the way through that remaining dough, and we're going to keep on working it until we've got a nice smooth elastic dough. As I suspected, this is nice and messy. Okay, and obviously it's quite difficult to incorporate that batter at the moment. We just need to keep working it in. Now you may have noticed behind me I've got some eggs. We're going to be using a lot of egg yolks later, not at this stage, but they should be at room temperature. You can see here now, after 10 minutes of kneading, we've gone from that buttery mess, which you think to yourself, that's never ever going to combine in there. The dough is just an oily mess, if you like. However, you start noticing as you're kneading it, as you're working the dough, it's gradually becoming a lot more like the dough you had earlier. It's getting smoother, It's getting more elastic. Your hands are getting cleaner. The surface is getting cleaner as, I wouldn't say dries up, but as it becomes more incorporated in there and becomes your more familiar looking elastic dough. Now you're going to need somewhere warm, so around about 27 to 30 degrees. And what we're going to do is we're just going to shape that back into a rough ball. It's fairly smooth. You could possibly do with a little bit more kneading, but time is of the essence. So I'm going to put that in that bowl, just cover that over, and like I say, that's going to go somewhere warm for 7 hours, and then we're going to prepare the final dough. Here we go, some 7 hours later, and you can see I've kept it somewhere nice and warm, and you can see it's risen considerably. So at this point I'm going to transfer it. Ooh, that bit wanted to escape. I'm going to transfer it, you can see how much that's deflated now, into my stand mixer. Okay, and just going to retain this bowl ready for our final sort of rise. Okay, so that's the bigger, or gone back into there, and now what we're going to add to that is some more flour, same flour, and I've got 60 grams of that, and then I've got 30 grams of water. And what we're going to do is we're now just going to make sure that's all nicely mixed together. Now when it's just started to all come together, we're then going to start adding some egg yolk. Now I've got 130, is it 130, 135? 130 grams of egg yolk. Okay, and we're just going to start this blending. When it's almost combined together, I'm going to add in a third of that egg yolk. No, I'm not. I knew I'd put them in an order. Forget that. Before I do the egg yolk, I only put in some sugar in. And I've got some more of that cast sugar. Again, if you've got the golden cast sugar, use that, but I've got 40 grams of cast sugar. So I'm now just going to tip in that sugar. And we want to get that all nicely combined in there as well. Then we'll be adding a third of the egg yolks and getting that mixed in before we're going to add the variety of flavours. Now we're flavouring this with vanilla, honey. The honey, I've got 35 grams of honey, clear runny honey obviously, and I've got 5 grams of Panettone aroma. Okay, bakery bits this one, and we'll be adding that in before we add the remainder of the egg yolks. So like I say, I've got 130 grams of egg yolks here. I'm going to add about a third of it, and then we're just going to set that down, and now we want to get this combined into that dough. So that's almost gone sort of smooth. So at this point I'm going to add a teaspoon of vanilla essence. Now you could use about a gram of a vanilla pod. You know, scraping this bit from your side, but I haven't got that amount of vanilla pods. Like I say, this Panettone aroma sort of oil, if you like, 5 grams of that, in that goes. And then finally we're going to add this honey. Now we've still got the rest of the egg yolks to go in. We're going to need to add some salt, some butter, and we will also have the typical sort of candied fruit that you would normally have in there, but first we're just going to make sure that that's all blended in. So now we add the egg yolk, a little bit at a time. As it starts to get combined in, gradually add the rest. And we're obviously going to continue that to all the eggs in there, and it's all completely mixed in. Now I've got 6 grams of sea salt again in that dough, and we'll just get that combined in there. For our final thing is some more unsalted butter. I've got 60 grams there of softened butter, and then I'm going to get that in there. And now make sure that's all thoroughly combined together. That's become quite elastic now, that butter's all blended in. So I've turned this down to slow. I'm going to add 20 grams of raisins. And then, actually, I might turn that off, it might be easier. Just tip this in like this. Here I've got 220 grams of candied peel. So, they don't pull very easily, so like that. And now we're just going to gently mix that all in together, and then that will be all our mixing done. So that original bowl that I had the bigger in, I've now lightly oiled that, and what we're going to do is I'm just going to scrape the contents of this into there, and then I'm just going to cover that over, and we're just going to let it rest for about 40 minutes to an hour. We're not expecting large rise at this point. We're just sort of giving it a bit of a rest and hoping that we get a little bit of a rise, because we will be turning this out, shaping it more, and it's got at least another 6 odd hours, 7, possibly even 8, before we put it in the oven. So it can be late finished tonight. Okay, so there you go. That's that stage finished. It's had a little bit of a rise, but now we're ready for our final shaping and final proving. So I've got a 1 kilo Panettone case here. Okay, it does have holes on the bottom, so I'm going to put this obviously on a baking tray, especially when we come to cook it. I don't want anything leaking out, but also I think it's going to need a bit of support anyway. So what we want to attempt to do is remove this and shape it into a ball. Okay, but the dough is very, very soft, so to be honest, I don't think there's much point in trying to shape this too much, because it's not going to hold it. So instead, I'm just going to turn it directly out into that Panettone case. So we have made essentially a 1 kilo, or we should be making a 1 kilo Panettone, but you can see it's obviously, whoops, it's obviously not filling up the case. We expect this to rise. We expect it to rise a lot. Okay, and traditionally it should form a bit of a dome on top, and we obviously want to preserve that, but how we do that comes later. So what we're now going to do is we're just going to let this stand in a warm place for about another 6 to 7 hours. In a little while, obviously before this is done, we're going to prepare a sort of topping known as a glasser, who knows, which we'll be spreading on top. Now you don't have to use one of them, but if you're not going to do that, what we normally do, you would split the top, put a little bit of butter in the split, which sort of helps it sort of rise or whatever. But anyway, we're not doing that. We're going to have the more traditional glasser, which will have some sugar nibs. I couldn't think what it's called then. Okay, so that's it for another 6-7 hours. If in the meantime it has risen, if it has tripled in size, then we're good to go. 2.5 hours so far, and it's rising slowly. But what we're going to do in the meantime is we're going to prepare this sort of topping that goes on it before we bake it, a glasser or whatever. Now, you can make this up to a week in advance apparently, keep it in the fridge in a sealed container, and the original quantity was for like 3 to 4, but I'm unlikely to make another panettone within a week, so I've halved the quantities, so this should be enough for 2. I should hope so, looking at what's here. So to start with, in this bowl here, I've got egg white. I've got 25 grams of egg white, and into that I'm going to put some plain sort of vegetable oil, sort of unflavoured vegetable oil. I've got 3 grams of that. So in that goes. Then got, how much is it? I have to remember I'm halving everything. This is 1 gram of cocoa powder. Seems a lot for 1 gram. Now, the glasser is a sweet topping. So we've got here some caster sugar. I've got 50 grams of that, in that's going. But then we want a little bit of a sort of nutty, crunchy texture to it. So I've got some almond flour. I've got 50 grams of almond flour. I've got rice flour. Now, if you haven't got any rice flour, you can have corn flour instead. I've got 6 grams of that, and then something with a bit more texture to it, like cornmeal. Fairly coarse grained cornmeal, okay, and I've got 20 grams of that. So in goes the cornmeal, in goes the rice flour, and in goes the ground almonds. And we're now just going to mix that all together. So it is more or less going to form a paste, if you like. So don't sort of worry too much about the fact you've got that cocoa colour, okay? That isn't really going to sort of unduly change the colour at the top, because obviously remember panettone will sort of be brown on top anyway from when we bake it, hopefully. So I'm just going to make sure that they're all fully combined together, and then we're just going to cover that over, put that into the fridge until we're ready to bake it. And like I say, this we spread on the top and then we bake it. But the final other thing we're going to put in it is some like panettone sugar, or sugar nibs or sugar crumbs, which I've got there ready to go. You want something sort of wet enough that they're going to stick to. Some people put sliced almonds, and again you get your glasser on there first, and then you can essentially make sure these stick to it so they don't sort of fall off. Okay, you can see that as I'm gradually getting this all combined, it is forming quite a nice pliable paste. So we are now at that stage where we're just waiting for the finish of that 6-hour rise, so that we can bake it. Now when we bake, we're baking in a fan oven at 150. Okay, and baking will probably take about 50 minutes. But obviously it's going to darken on top, but also we want the right texture for panettone inside, so it'd be ideal if you get your thermometer, and we want it to be 85 centigrade in the middle when we then can remove it, and the heat from the crust will probably bring that up another 5 degrees or so and continue just off that final little baking. But like I said, traditionally the panettone is sort of almost like underdone inside. As it happens, this has risen, this has had 4 hours, and you can see it has risen considerably. Now my glasser was a little bit thicker than really it should be. So I've added a little bit more egg white. Okay, and I've transferred it into a piping bag. And what we're going to do is, it's just simply because it's just easier this way, but you don't have to necessarily do this. And all we're going to do is, I'm just going to pipe it over the surface. So we're not necessarily doing like a full coat. Like I say to you, there is more than enough there for one panettone. Oops, making a mess everywhere. Now, our final little addition is some sugar nibs. Now, I bought these thinking that this is what they were, and this first time I've opened them, and to be honest, they're a little bit finer. So although they are quite coarse grains, they're not quite as coarse as we'd really like them for a panettone. Okay, wanted a bit more chunkier ones. So I'm just lightly spreading some over the top. It just happens I use that. It's irrelevant the size of it. Okay, and now that is going into the oven at 150, and it should be for about 50 minutes. Now, let me just get that in there. I'll put my time on 40, just so I'm keeping an eye on it. In the background, you might notice I've got some boxes. When the panettone comes out, one of the problems with it is that it can start collapsing. We don't want that with the panettone. So what we do is, using two panettone skewers, which, given the price of 2 bits of bloody wire, I'm using these skewers. Okay, the panettone ones are round and thin. These are a bit flat, but I ain't paying out like 15 quid for a pair of bloody wires that this will do a job. What we do is we spear it in the bottom so that we can literally invert the panettone, and then we're going to set up 2 towers. It's not Lord of the Rings. Obviously there's going to be a big enough gap there, but I'm just demonstrating. The idea being that the height needs to be enough that the panettone can sit hanging upside down to cool completely. So you won't be eating this tonight. Bloody won't anyway, because it'll be too bleeding late. We leave it hanging upside down to cool completely, and because obviously this is speared through the case, it don't fall out of the case. Okay, and then tomorrow, when it's fully cooled, obviously we can turn it up the right way, take the skewers out, and we're ready to eat it. Okay, so that's what that's about. So I'm just going to tidy up, and we'll catch up when it's time to get inverting. 50 minutes. I did check it at 40, and the temperature certainly wasn't up, but I've just checked it, and it's just a fraction under 80, but it comes out clean, so that's cooked, and it does feel quite firm. Now, I don't want to show you, because the next stage we've got to work quickly, and we're going to get it skewered and suspended. Okay, it ain't going to stay there all night. I won't be allowed to. But I've just put that there for now, just so you can see what we can do. So it's speed is of the essence, because we don't want it collapsing, but I don't think it's going to collapse, to be honest. So get it out, skewer it, and turn it upside down. You can see it has risen a little bit. So we're going to get these skewers through. 1, 2, and then, like I say, the idea is we want to, actually it does look like it is starting to slightly collapse a little bit. It hasn't quite got the big dome, but then again, bear in mind, when it rose, it didn't go all the way over the top. It has risen a bit during cooking, and it did look like a little bit like it was starting to collapse on itself as I was poking them through. So the trick with this now is we leave it until resting on that plastic bit there. We now leave it until it is fully cooled before we eat it. So that's going to be tomorrow. And given that I'm working tomorrow, it's going to probably be in about 24 hours time. But I'm sure we can wait. So here it is, nicely cooled. Been about 24 hours to be honest. Panettone. I've removed the outer paper, there's still a bit on the bottom. So what we're going to do is we're just going to slice through it and take a slice out like you would if you were slicing a cake. You could slice it sort of vertically if you wished, it's up to you. But let's try and remove that slice. There we go. There is a bit of fruit visible in there. The orange is not quite as visible, you know, the candied peel, but you can see some raisins. Now, quite often this would be traditionally served with something like sweet wine, because it can be a little dry. Let's have a little taster. I mean, you can cut it into evenly thin slices. We don't have to be thin, but even slices. You can toast it. It's obviously sweet. I would say it's definitely more of a cake than a bread as such. I'm getting the bits of fruit, which, like I say, it doesn't look that visible, but it's in there. You can see it, perhaps it just doesn't show up very well on the camera. Let's try a bit with the glass on top. So that gives a nice, I was going to say chocolatey. There's not an awful lot of chocolate in that, and not a lot of cocoa, but you definitely get a bit of chocolate with it. So there you go. There's our panettone. If you serve this to guests, don't pre-slice it, because it will start to dry out. So basically either let them serve themselves or slice it as and when they want it. But you put it with cream. Oh, got some cream in the cupboard, in fridge. Wife won't eat it. Might have that for dessert later. Traditional Italian Panattone.